or so where China, who the source of the best quality fluorospar, which is a mineral that starts the value chain for fluoropolymers, they started restricting exports. We're trying to grow the downstream business internally within China, and so all the manufacturers had to qualify other sources. That's happened. Get it from Mexico, South Africa, Vietnam. So there was a lot of turmoil in pricing for spar during that previous time, and once they all qualified them, it's stabilized. Very reasonable incremental cost increase or flat, and so there's no current trend that I'm aware of. And natural gas is cheap, so the energy is one of the big components of the cost of making fluoropolymers. So really good from a supply side for fluoropolymers. Probably the only other potential, and it hasn't happened in a while, but some of the late entrants into the fluoropolymer industries in China, particularly, there'd be a plant going up once a year, where that would kind of rock the industry for a while temporarily. In fact, one of DuPont's joint venture plants in Japan didn't have an explosion, but they had an issue, and that actually impacted PFA, because that's where half the PFA is made for the Chemours side of the industry. So that that's a temporary thing, but one of those plants, they're very high capital intensive, very hazardous, high pressure, high temperature processes. So if something goes wrong, it's usually 8 months to a year before that facility is back running. Daikin had a similar problem 10 years ago, and so that's kind of an ad hoc or a one-off. But it impacts supply, especially if it's especially in the case of PFA, because Daikin and Chemours probably make, I'm going to say, 60 or 70% of the PFA today. So
50 to 70%?
Yeah, I'd say a big chunk, a majority, clearly a majority of the PFA is made by Daikin or Chemours. And so, they've got an asset in Japan. Chemours got one in Japan. They both have one in the U.S. So there's 4 main assets in the world producing at least 60% of the PFA, if not more. So if one of those goes down, then you're going to get a disruption in supply for the short term, 6 months to a year. But knock on wood, I'm not aware of any accidents anybody's had in the last 5 or 10 years.
Okay, that makes sense. So a follow-up question. I had one expert say, hey, supply is limited to a handful of plants around the year. Demand is clicking along at a pretty good clip. So that would suggest that pricing for PFA resin is going to continue to have pricing pressure over the foreseeable future. Is that something that you would agree with, disagree with, nuance? What would be your reaction to that kind of a comment?
When you say pricing pressure, you mean to increase price of resin?
Yeah. If PFA demand is growing at 8% per year or something significant over GDP, however, there are only a handful of main PFA plants around the world, what is the impact to price and availability?
Yeah. Again, it's determined, I think, by the ebbs and flows of the semicon market. There's favorable situations for the manufacturer of the PFA when it's going wide open and a lot of fabs being built. But then during those troughs, I think there's available capacity today. So it's kind of a feast or famine. That's not the right term, but clearly the ability to raise price for the manufacturer is there when there's high activity in semicon, because it just dominates.